Yeah, there we go. Wow. Connor, people are showing up. No pressure. Just release days. Getting the numbers up. People want to hear about the monuments.
That's great.
Well, welcome everybody. We'll go ahead and get started as people are loading in here. Welcome to another broadcast of Reader Meet Writer. My name is Wiley Cash. I'm your host. I am here with Siba. I am the 2019 recipient of the Pat Conroy Legacy Award. I'm also the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today and to hear about this really interesting and unfortunately very timely book, Down Along with the Devil's Bones. But before we begin, I want to let you know about a couple of events and also let you or encourage you to do a couple of things at the top of the show. The first thing I would encourage you to do is to purchase Connor's book from the bookstore that brought you here this afternoon. Perhaps your favorite independent bookstore. You found out about Connor's book because you're on their email list, you saw their Facebook advertisement. Please purchase his book from that independent bookstore. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. They represent almost 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And one of those bookstores brought you here today. So please support your local independent bookstore and not that obscure website named after a river somewhere that no one's ever heard of. You can get your hammers and your nails and your vacuum cleaners from that place. Get your books from people who know about books. I also want to encourage you, if you have a question this afternoon about anything that Connor and I talk about, something historical, an idea that, that's the UPS guy delivering something, not something from Amazon, but I encourage you to go down to the Q&A and type in a question that you may have for Connor, and I will ask him those questions at the end of the show. So at any moment, if something sticks in your mind and you say, I want to explore that further, or I've never known about that obscure moment in history or that idea, please make sure you ask that question. And when you type in your question, make sure to mention your name and make sure to mention your independent bookstore where you shop. And then in closing, I want to encourage all of you to join us Thursday evening. I'll be in conversation with Lisa Unger, 7 p.m., Confessions on the 745. That'll be a great event as well. This is a pulse-pounding, intense novel. Be careful who you tell your darkest secrets. So I'll be with Lisa Unger Thursday evening. So please check back in with the bookstore that brought you here tonight. But we are here to talk about Connor's new book, Down Along with the Devil's Bones. So I want to introduce him. Connor Towne O'Neill's writing has appeared in New York Magazine, Vulture, Slate, and The Village Voice, and he works as a producer on the NPR podcast White Lies, which was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize in audio reporting. Originally from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he lives in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and teaches at Auburn University and with the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. This is his first book, and what a book it is. And this is actually release day, so that's a big deal. This is his first event, so I'm quite honored that he's doing it with SIBA and that I get to join him. So Connor, thank you so much for being with us and sharing this book with us.
Thanks, Wiley. It's good to be with you. I appreciate you. Taking the time to talk with me on release day of all days.
Sure, yeah.
I don't want to be anywhere else.
Yeah, congratulations. So at the top here, can you tell us a little bit about the book, about what led you to write about these monuments, about white supremacy, about and placing yourself in it? Just kind of give us that agent editor pitch that gives us an idea of what the book's about.
Yeah. So over the last 5 years, I've been following campaigns to remove 4 monuments of Nathan Bedford Forrest in 4 different cities across the country: in Selma, Alabama, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in Nashville, and in Memphis. And Forrest is a Confederate general known as the Wizard of the Saddle, revered by by Southerners of a certain stripe for his tactical prowess in the Civil War. But he was also a slave trader before the war. He's an accused war criminal for the massacre at Fort Pillow during the war. After the war, he served as the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and operated a convict leasing plantation on President's Island, just outside of Memphis. So his life touches on so many flashpoints of racial violence and inequity. And so there's this sort of fractured memory. Some people revere him, others, think of him as the devil, as General Sherman referred to him during the war. And yet his monuments are everywhere. There's a county in Mississippi named after him. There's a city in Arkansas with his name. There are more markers in Tennessee than there are to that state's 3 presidents. And of course, road signs, roads, schools bear his name. So he's sort of everywhere. When I was reporting this book, I called up Madison Smart Bell, the novelist, who has a great novel about Forrest, Devil's Dream. And he told me growing up in Nashville, Forrest was just the water that you swam in. He was everywhere. And for me, he at first just kind of registered as, that joke from Forrest Gump about how he got his name and how sometimes people do stupid things. But that's, I grew up in the North. There aren't those sorts of Southern folk heroes. I guess don't make it up. Not too many of them make it up above the Mason-Dixon line. But I had this weird chance encounter in the spring of 2015 that kind of tipped me off to thinking about Forrest and to thinking about monuments to him. And that happened on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the sort of high point, the climax of the civil rights movement, when nonviolent marchers protesting for voting rights were attacked on Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge. It was the 50th anniversary of that in Selma, and I was there to report on it. President Obama was going to speak. It was this, massive event. 40,000 other people showed up. And I was a broke graduate student at the time, so I was driving around the town. It's a pretty sleepy city, and so 40,000 people showing up, including Secret Service for the president, really sort of shut the city down. So I was looking for free parking anywhere I could find it, and decided I'd turn into the cemetery that's in the city. And Selma is one of those southern cities that has a pretty prolific cemetery. It has its own roads in it. You can imagine the Spanish moss hanging on the magnolias, the mausoleums. And so I thought, I'll tuck my car in there. I'll walk over. I'll listen to the president speak. It'll be this sort of triumphant, moment of honoring civil rights history. But when I pull into the cemetery, I start seeing all of these signs saying Confederate Memorial Circle closed, no trespassing. And that's just sort of catnip for a reporter, So I park my car, I wander over, and immediately people sort of descend on me and, giving me wary looks and ask me what I'm doing there. Well, it turns out that these were people from a group known as the Friends of Forrest, a group of neo-Confederates who live in and around Selma, who had spent really the better part of 2 decades fighting to honor Nathan Bedford Forrest with a bronze bust. It had originally gone up in 2000. It was stolen in 2012, and they had just won a court battle that was going to allow them to replace that statue. And so they were out there on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday to sort of prepare the grounds and get ready to unveil this new monument of Forrest. And the dissonance of that encounter really stuck with me. Like I said, I didn't really know who Forrest was or what it meant to put up a monument to him, although I had an idea of what it meant. I was just so baffled and intrigued by this confluence of Civil War and civil rights history and how it was all seemed to be impacting the present still, that I started looking into Forrest and his monuments. And then a couple months later, Dylann Roof murders 9 parishioners of Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And all of a sudden, there's this massive referendum on Confederate iconography, symbols, the flag, and of course monuments. And as these protest movements broke out across the country to try and remove these Confederate symbols, I figured Forrest was my guy, and that I was gonna follow some campaigns to take his monuments down. And so what the book is the dispatches from my reporting over the course of the last 5 years following 4 of these campaigns, and looking into the history of Forrest's life and of his afterlife in these monuments.
So I didn't plan on asking this, but reminding me of how the book begins makes me want to return to that moment when you're in the cemetery and you meet this man and woman. And, I'm not a reporter, but, I've been at events where I meet people like the 2 folks that you meet in the cemetery. And one thing I've noticed that people do who have very polemicized points of view or on extreme poles is they try to bring you in and identify a connection between the 2 of you. And I can't remember what the guy says to you, but he says something like, do you believe in the 10th Amendment? I think it's the 10th Amendment. And you're
That's
like,
right.
Of course I do. It's in the Constitution. He's like, well, then you're a states' rights guy. You ought to join the Nathan Bedford Forrest League or whatever. And so I'm wondering about that as an entree to, supporting the idea of the Confederacy. But I'm also wondering about Forrest and I've often wondered why he's so revered, and this book made me ask this too. What are your thoughts on him as a symbol of the everyman? He wasn't trained in military the way the other revered journals, Sherman or Robert E. Lee or Longstreet's were. He was just, he was kind of a gritty, seat of his pants businessman. And is that a key to his reverence? Is that why he's so revered, that I could have been Nathan Bedford Forrest? And seeking out these connections between people, is that part of his power or the power of his legacy?
I think so. Yeah, that sort of blue collar appeal, I think, is really important. The fact that he wasn't trained at West Point. He hardly had any schooling to his name. So that puts him, as you say, in stark contrast to the sort of Southern gentry that Robert E. Lee embodies. And that's important to note too, because he doesn't have that standing, because he enlisted in the Confederacy as a private, and then steadily rose through the ranks as he proved himself. He's seen a little bit as like what could have been. If only, we had seen Forrest's genius earlier, the South may have won the Civil War. I think that kind of thinking imbues his legacy. And so you see, he's sort of conspicuously absent from, say, Stone Mountain. And yet by the 1990s, he's, Dixie Outfitters is selling 5 Forrest t-shirts for every 1 they sell of Lee. And so I think his myth has grown over the 20th century as there's more saber rattling and sort of teeth gnashing about, the lost cause and, returning to Confederate symbols in moments like the Civil Rights Movement and the moment that we're in now.
And I'm also thinking about Forrest allows, as you said, he didn't go to West Point. He didn't have Robert E. Lee's landed gentry heritage. And, I think that the past 10 years or so, especially in the South, has seen such a standing against expertise. That expertise is something, if you have a strong gut instinct, you don't need expertise. Do you think that's also part of Forrest's? I mean, he does rise, as you point in the book. I mean, what is he, like lieutenant general at the end?
Yeah, the most promoted soldier of the war.
Yeah, so I mean, it's instinct. It's not training. So if Forrest can do it, I can do it. I don't know. It's such a strange, relevant, contemporary thing. I mean, we have a president who goes on gut instinct. I mean, he's even admitted essentially, I'm not preparing for the debates tonight. I'm just going to go with my gut.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is that disdain almost for expertise and a reliance on, or a valuing of instinct. Sort of the pointy heads be damned. And I think that impacts how Civil War history gets remembered. I think how the lost cause history was able to endure is because it's emotional history. It's not, people can disregard the referendum really that's happened over the past couple of decades, with historians countering that kind of rose-tinted glasses view of the Confederacy and what the Civil War was about. So yeah, I think that it's all bound up together, from presidential politics to history to our memories and who our heroes are.
So you're from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and is that how you pronounce it, Lancaster?
That's right. That's good. That's a way that we know when people aren't from there. They say Lancaster.
I was trying to remember how I've heard it pronounced correctly. And in the book you write, being from the North and being from the state where Gettysburg happened, which was the turning point of the Civil War, which gave the North the certainty of victory, you always felt, and there's this beautiful simile in the book where you kayak beneath a bridge that the Union destroyed to keep Robert E. Lee's army that sent them to Gettysburg. And your whole life, you felt as if you were floating above the Civil War like a kayak floats on the river, that it was something that you were aware of but never really touched you. And then you come down to Alabama for an MFA, you're still living in Alabama. And when you meet Nathan Bedford Forrest in the cemetery there, you suddenly recall, oh, that's that sticker in the gas station. That's that joke that people say. So can you talk a little bit about confronting the South as a person from Pennsylvania and what your entree to the South was like?
Yeah, absolutely. Robert Penn Warren calls it the treasury of virtue, the Northerners' idea that because they're associated with the Union and the Union won the Civil War and the consequence of the victory is the emancipation of the slaves, that, well, we're good. We've done this great deed. We're not responsible to our history because we did this great thing. It doesn't touch us. That's how Civil War memory worked for me growing up, but it's also how my sense of race worked growing up. Like, I think that there's a sense that, like, the problem of race in America is a problem for Black people. It used to be a problem. And then brave people like Martin Luther King stood up and marched and solved it. And same thing. Now we're all good. And we're not encouraged to, white people so often are not encouraged to think about how race shapes our lives too. It sort of works as the default to the norm, the sort of room tone of American life. We don't think about it much, or at least I hadn't growing up. And for a Northerner, that's because it's down there, right? And that's race. If race is still a problem in America, it's a problem in the South. It's not a problem up here. And so you move to Alabama, and it is a little, it floats a little closer to the surface. And, when I moved to Alabama, it was the summer of 2013, and there were a series of 50th anniversaries happening. Of course, there would be the one in Selma a couple years later, but even when I first got there, there was the 50th anniversary of the stand in the schoolhouse door, the 50th anniversary, in the school that I was then attending. The 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. So my first encounters of Alabama and living here were asking me to make this connection between civil rights history and the present. So it got me thinking more about race in America and how there were lasting inequities here. Of course, this is all happening in the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, protests over extrajudicial killing of Black Americans. So there are connections to be made, but it wasn't really until that encounter in the cemetery when I realized, like, oh, okay, if I really want to understand the deeper tensions at work here, I was going to have to go back another 100 years. I was going to have to look at how the Civil War and the the tensions, the central questions of that war, about whether a slave society could really transform itself into a multiracial democracy. If I was going to grapple with that question, I would have to, I would have to look at the Civil War. And so Forrest became my way of doing that.
Sure, the lens through which to see the past and the present, because he is a good prism to project, to see the past and project it onto the future, or at least the present moment. Mm-hmm. So the book is kind of organized through your experiences in these 4 cities: Murfreesboro, Selma, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee, and Memphis, Tennessee. Can you tell us about your experiences on the ground in a couple of those cities? We've talked a little bit about Selma, but maybe Murfreesboro or Memphis or Nashville, like what the monuments were like there and what the experience was like there, reporting there?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Murfreesboro, the story that I was following was a group of students at Middle Tennessee State University that's located there. They, in the aftermath of the Charleston 9 murders, that next academic year, the 2015-2016 school year, they launched this protest campaign to try and get the school to rename one of the buildings on campus that was named after Forrest. And that the way that the school chose to respond to that was to, as so many schools do, they launched a task force, and that task force was going to hold a number of public forums, and that they would hear from all comers, pro and con, whether they should change this name. And so that school year and the debate that university had, I think, really laid out both the fractured nature of how we remember Forrest, but also a deeper schism, ideological schism in this country. People of color who want to really challenge the way that power structures, whether they be political or universities, remember their past in a certain way, and the consequences of remembering that past in a certain way, leading to environments that don't feel welcoming, or in some cases actively hostile to them. So that was really a moving experience to talk with these student activists who were really challenging their school to be more accountable to their history, and to try and get past these symbols that are still here, that are abhorrent to them. As one student activist put it, his name's Joshua Crutchfield, an amazing student of history. He was a master's student of history at the time when he was working on this campaign. And he said at times it felt like he was working harder to improve the university than the university was to improve him. So that was really moving and enlightening to talk with those students. One of the possibilities on the table at that university was they could change the name, of course, so they could keep the name, or the third route was to keep the name but with added context. And when I first started reporting, that potential intrigued me a little bit. Like, okay, what would it mean for this university to really square up to this history and to be transparent and honest about how in the late 50s, after the Brown v. Board decision, but before the school had integrated, this school decides to name their ROTC building after Forrest. And this is a school that has Forrest, a student dressing up as Forrest as its mascot. The band is playing Dixie. There's this huge bronze medallion of Forrest on the student center. I mean, they are enmeshed in Forrest iconography. And I thought it would be really interesting to see what would the language on that plaque look like if you could really be honest about why Forrest was there and what he was doing, with the sort of emotional role that he was providing for the white students and for the white, administrators there who were making these decisions. That was intriguing to me. I wondered what that might look like. But students were like, that's not the issue here. The issue is that when I'm walking across the campus to go to 9 a.m. biology, I'm reminded that this school is honoring a man who didn't think that I was human. This was true in different ways in reporting all of these 4 cities, but that moment really sticks out to me as a moment where I came to understand the deeper consequences of these symbols, and their meaning for the people affected by them.
I really like Crutchfield's idea, like as you said in the book, where he says something to the effect of, I'm working harder to improve the university than it is to improve me. And I feel like the quick answer when people bring up monuments is they say, Well, that monument, the fact that we don't like it, we need to keep it up to prove how much we've changed as a society, which is to say the individual needs to do the emotional, psychological, intellectual work of understanding they've been elevated in the eyes of the law instead of us removing this monument. And so to Crutchfield's point, it's a big ask of an individual to say, you need to stand in the face of this marker of your inhumanity, and you need to do the work. You need to do the mental, historical, intellectual gymnastics required to stick your chest out on your way to biology at 9:00 in the morning, because we're certainly not going to do it. That's the big ask of the individual versus the institution.
Right, exactly. And it goes back to a feeling, a sort of knee-jerk reaction, like, this is not my problem. The questions of race in America are not for white people. But I think that again, that there were moments like these that prompted more self-reflection and to ask me to be accountable too. I mean, it was one thing to approach it as, oh, I'm just a white Northern liberal. I don't have much of a stake in this. I'm just a reporter. I'm seeing what y'all are doing. But there were moments like that made me realize, like, I do have a stake in this, and I need to interrogate that stake in it, because even though, I might have first come to this feeling distance from this history, the more that you dig into the history that comes up in any one of these monuments, say at MTSU, and what it meant that it was illegal for students to go there until the school integrated in 1962. And then those first waves of students just felt so isolated and alienated. I interviewed a alum from MTSU who had led a protest movement to try and get the mascot off the sidelines and the band to stop playing Dixie in the 60s. And he said, it was just like, it felt like being on a different planet, just the hostility that those students faced. So that prompted self-reflection too, thinking about my own experiences with education and how race had shaped them. We know from how mortgages historically have worked in this country that race impacted my parents' ability to buy their house, which impacted who I grew up with, impacted what schools I went to, how those schools were funded, how I was seen and treated by teachers and police officers growing up, how I was able to get student loans co-signed, the building of assets and wealth and education are all bound up in this racial hierarchy that we have. And so while at the outset, I felt like, okay, well, I'll report this story and I'll see whether they change the name of Forest Hall, really prompted me to see the much deeper issues here that impacted me just as much as they did anyone else.
Yeah, that's what I think is so wonderful about this book. And I would encourage y'all, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A box at the end, and I'll feed Connor your questions when I'm done haranguing him with questions of my own. But make sure you mention your name and the name of your favorite independent bookstore in your town. So, one thing that I really appreciated about this book, Connor, is you said, you're a Northern liberal, and it would have been easy for you to come down and, I'm a white Southerner. So, whatever. But it'd have been easy for you to come down and do what I'm doing now, but you didn't. You did this. And it felt like really self-reflexive, honest journalism, where the questions you're asking of the people who have erected, praised, sustained these monuments are also questions you're asking about yourself and asking yourself. And the questions are uncomfortable, and sometimes your answers, your responses are uncomfortable. What did you set out to do that, or was that just a product of the project or of the times? How did that happen?
I think it was a little bit of it was a little bit of both. It was things that I discovered in the reporting process, but also a product of the times too. Reporting this particular story over the past 5 years, I mean, there are just so many flashpoints that, and the way that we talk about race, I think, has really evolved and changed over the past couple of years. So I think it was a little bit of both. But certainly when I started, I was a little bit more naive about how I was approaching this story. One moment really sticks out, which was trying to tracked down the former mayor of Selma, a man named Reverend James Perkins Jr. He was elected in 2000 as the first Black mayor of Selma. And this is the city that is synonymous with Black voting rights. He ousted the mayor who had been mayor since Bloody Sunday. And the first weekend that he's in office, a statue of Forrest goes up. And so I knew I had to talk to him. I knew that he was going to be a really important figure in the Selma section of this book. I really wanted to know what it meant to him that happened and hear his reflection on the experience. But he was pretty skeptical of me and wasn't, as you might imagine, wasn't, thrilled to have someone call him up, 15 years later to talk about this stuff. But part of his skepticism was basically that he wasn't going to talk to me about what it meant for him for that statue to go up in his first week in office until and unless I could talk about what it meant for me that statue went up, which is to say, like, I needed to know that I had a stake in this too. And that if I was just doing some, straight third person objective reporting, and wasn't going to think about the stake I had in this, the consequence that this history had for me too, he was maybe not gonna waste his breath. So we had a pretty frank conversation before our actual interview in which I had to, come talk about how I was coming to some hard truths about how race operates in this country and how it has shaped my life and how I was using this story to try and grapple with it. So I think in a way, this book is a hybrid book. It's a mash of a couple of different approaches. I'm using the tools of journalism. I'm drawing on so much history, but there's also personal elements too. It's not a straight memoir, but there are moments where I consistently sort of turn in and try and understand the consequences of this history for me too. And so I'm sort of all three of those disciplines, journalism, history, and memoir, are being used to interpret the others in certain ways. And so it makes for it, it's not straight reporting or it's not straight history, but hopefully because I'm trying to get at the consequence of this history and getting personal was the way of doing that. And to your point about the sort of defense of white Southerners, like that wasn't a tack that I was interested in taking. The Mason-Dixon line is a fiction, really, at least as it involves race in America. And so I needed to point it at myself as much as I did anyone else.
And I think your conversation with the former mayor and that happens relatively early in the book. I feel like that is such a great jumping off point because I get the sense that the mayor's, expectation that this was going to be a two-way street comes from a sense of exhaustion.
Yeah.
Of just being asked the same question by a white reporter who's going to report on it, put it away, and never think about it again. And it was an invitation to engage in an honest moment. We've got a ton of questions. I'm going to try to package three of them from Jane and Copperfish Books in Punta Gorda, from Jenna, page 158 in Wake Forest, from Tariana, living out in Denver. I'll give a shout out to Tattered Cover. What do you think should happen to these monuments that are coming down? How do we reckon with the physicality of our cultural memory? What should we do with these things? That's a big question, and I know the answer may be different town to town, but.
Yeah, I'm inclined to leave it up to town to town. I mean, they're coming down because of a political will that has galvanized over the past couple of years. They're down because people want them down, and so I'm inclined to let whatever happens to them be the will of the people. Some of them, the statue in Memphis that was taken down at the end of 2017 appears to be headed for a planned Confederate museum in Middle Tennessee. So museums are equipped to add more context, more, and they're not placing them in public in a sort of honorific way. But the Confederates are sort of getting their guy back, or at least the statue of him back. I don't know. There's a statue in Uruguay that was taken down a while back that they've cut up and sort of cemented back together with all this sort of Frankensteined back together. And I like the visual sort of reclaiming of that, or remixing of that as a sort of power shift, because I think that's really what these monuments are. I think thinking of them as weather vanes is a useful framework. They're up, they start to go up during the reimposition of Jim Crow, the turn of the 20th century. So, Reconstruction had been toppled. Former Confederates had returned to power, or reimposing Jim Crow, or reimposing white supremacy as the law of the land. And as they're doing that, the statues go up as a sort of reflection of that political shift. And they're coming down now at another moment of reckoning. So I'm inclined to defer to the people who have coalesced into movements to take them down.
It's so interesting you said, we can, when the monuments were going up during Jim Crow, I live here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I wrote an essay recently based on an equity, a nonprofit here in town that gathers data to bend social organizations toward equity. And they put together a timeline of Confederate monuments in North Carolina. And the high water mark for Confederate memorialization in North Carolina was between 1905 and 1912, which is the Niagara Convention, founding of the NAACP. And you can really see almost a moment by moment response of the Confederacy rises as Black achievement and Black self-awareness rises to meet the moment. And to your point, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the Charleston Nine, these things start falling when these deaths start occurring, and society responds to them. It's going to be interesting 100 years from now, as we're looking back 100 years to the early 20th century. What are folks going to think about us, at this time, responding in the way and taking these things down? It's really, really fascinating. So we've got a question from your stomping grounds, Ernest and Hadley down there in Tuscaloosa. Eastie wants to know, how has your book been received by the local African-American community and by the Alabama faculty? What's been the experience of people knowing you're doing this work? I know today's release day, but what has the experience been in your community?
It's been really positive so far, which is, I know I sound like I'm sort of picking the straw out of my hair when I say this, but it's really incredible to me that this book even just exists in the world, and to have people read it and find things in it that are moving or interesting to them, that they want to respond to me about it, I think is really powerful and incredible. Writing is such lonely work, so that when it finds readers, it's just, it makes it all seem so worthwhile. So, I'm kind of bowled over, and I look forward to hearing from more people. I'm sending out copies now to sources and people who talked with me, and I'm on tenterhooks to hear what they think. Just because that's really the marker when you're talking to other people and they're sharing their experiences and reflections on those experiences with you. You want to get that right. And so I'm really curious to hear what they think. I've heard from some people who live in Memphis, people who lived in Charlottesville, cities that I've been writing about, and, to hear that they feel like, I got it right, or that they found things that were eye-opening or thought-provoking to them when these are places that they live and spend time. That's really validating and nice to hear.
Well, I want to give you another couple of questions, but here's a comment and a question. We have Karen from Princeton, New Jersey. Her home bookstore is Labyrinth Books in Princeton, New Jersey. She is a minister. She has used white lies as a holy text in sermons. Wow. And wants to thank you for that. That is I can't imagine higher praise than your words have been shared. Your work has been shared from the pulpit, and that is Connor's work that he does with NPR. But what advice do you have for people, for another white Northerner, one who does not have the roots you have for such a visit? What kind of advice do you have for people living above, as you say, the fictional Mason-Dixon line, to dip down and to look at this, to be honest with this?
Yeah, I mean, race is shaping all of our lives. And so I think just looking at where the inequity is, who has access to resources, to wealth, to education, to opportunity, to healthcare. Look in your own community and see where those inequities are, and hold the people that have that power to account. This is, because they're going to be white people, that's not by accident. So I think just looking at where disparities are in your community, this is something that's happening everywhere, and this is how we address these inequities and try and get past this history that's still with us. Is not taking it for granted, but thinking about how whiteness operates in so many different facets of our lives. It's always going to lead to inequity because that's what it was invented to do. I mean, if you go back and look at, colonial America and when whiteness starts to appear as in usage in laws, it's all about hoarding resources and opportunities. This is not some biological truth. It's a social construct, and it's been wielded to hoard wealth, hoard opportunities, and it still does. So, you don't need to move to Alabama to start thinking about this stuff or addressing it. It's happening everywhere.
Well, now we'll go out on this question. Now that you're speaking of moving back to Alabama, our final questioner goes simply by Martone. And Martone wants to know, Ernest and Hadley in Tuscaloosa is Martone's home bookstore. Now that you've returned to Tuscaloosa, what is your sense of the ongoing battle there now that Mildew Hall's name has been changed?
It's a great start. I mean, I think that was when I first started researching and reporting this, to go into Morgan Hall and to know the history of that name, of a Confederate, a Klansman, across the quad, to have one of the most famous eugenicists name on a building is, I mean, you just realize how this history is still with us, and we can't escape it until we square up to it. And so to have that change is super important, and I'm glad to see that name go. But I hope it's a start. I mean, it's a step in the right direction, but it's really just a start. I mean, there's so much inequity at the University of Alabama that I hope that we can harness this victory and make it a more equitable place for people of color.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Connor. And everybody, this is Connor's book, Down Along with That Devil's Bones. Please purchase it from the independent bookstore that brought you here this afternoon. And if not from that store, from your favorite local independent bookstore. Connor, thank you so much for being with us today on launch day, publication day. It's a big deal. It's a big deal book. It's a timely book. We may not like the times, but times like these need books like this. So thank you for writing it. Thanks for bringing it to our attention.
Wiley, thanks so much. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions. This was great. I enjoyed it.
Of course, yeah. And be sure to tune in with us Thursday night. We're going to be with Lisa Unger talking about her book, Confessions, on the 7:45, Thursday night at 7 p.m. I am your host, Wiley Cash. This has been another edition of SIVA's Reader Meet Writer. Thank you to all the independent bookstores for supporting this, and for all the readers. We had a great turnout tonight. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you on Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.